So in this video, I want to continue the conversations that we've been having about space privatization and racial capitalism. I really enjoyed starting off this series because I definitely think that racial capitalism will be a core part of the space privatization topic, because I feel like there's so much history to be done on terms of like where kind of like the desire to like go to space and use it as like an enterprise kind of like starts from in terms of Cold War imagery, and the way that it relates to various like forms of like privatization, extraction, and like forms of ghettoization, urbanization that are created by both private and public entities. And I feel like this resolution is one in which like creates a really meaningful conversation between like what is the kind of like balance and necessity of having like private and public kind of like space enterprise, and what is their relationship to each other. How do they kind of like set protocols and boundaries for like what is like good forms of like space exploration and what we should be doing like ethically in the face of that. And I think that this is kind of like a critique that really answers and is able to like dictate questions on both ends in terms of being able to like win, that the idea of just kind of being like better than space privatization isn't enough to win, that you like are not invested in systems of racial capitalism. And I feel like the last video that we did in the intro is really good at kind of like setting the stage on like what a lot of the historical questions are for the things that are happening in the context of like this resolution, and that kind of like set a context for a lot of the stuff that I'll be kind of talking about in this video as we get to talk about things like the link debate, the parent debate, impact comparison, alternative debate, all of which I think are obviously like really important parts of making this criticism work as a whole, and what I really want to make sure you have covered in order to like turn it into a strategy that's really useful in debates themselves. And so in this video, I want to start off particularly just thinking about the link debate in terms of just thinking about what are some of the go-to arguments that other teams are going to make. I feel like kind of like I said in the last video, a lot of the affirmative basis I feel like for this resolution will be like why things like public space exploration is kind of like inevitable and necessary in order to prevent various tragedies like asteroid space debris. It's important in order to be able to create new technology for like climate change and things like that. And also a lot of the arguments will be made in terms are about like why the kind of idea of making private space exploration unjust also as this kind of like it kind of like operates as this kind of like a signal for international modeling in terms of like how we should all be relating to the question of like space as like a public good and its relationship to like various other countries, which I think is a really good place for you to kind of like interject on the link argument at kind of all these levels. The first thing I feel like in terms of like what the concept of like what public space is like a neutral good in terms means, I feel like is one thing where you need to like make a bunch of arguments about like how the idea of like a public kind of space enterprise is birthed from that kind of like idea of like neutrality and like this neutral American subject that is created under like Cold War logics, and that was like created in order to justify further forms of ghettoization then, but has then transformed into this system in which like performs forces of extraction, various like tactics that are created by like police and various other carceral apparatus that impose various taxes and debts on the public are what create the necessary financial basis in order to continue to do things like the creation of like the technology and resources that are necessary to create it in order to like create and save like all humans in space from the types of threats that people are like trying to manage. So I feel like you need a good critique of the ways in which their kind of like solution towards the impacts that they're kind of offering at a top level, especially when they're related to the question of like technology and the prevention of disaster, are not only geared towards like a source of like human vitality that is like bad in terms of what it's willing to sacrifice in order to like save like everyone in terms of this idea of neutrality, but also why that technology can only be realized by being able to sacrifice certain populations, thus kind of like reiterating and solidifying the relationships and the carceral and the kind of like relationships that are embedded into like American culture that then become exported into our logics of space exploration. So even if we are able to create living conditions on another world, or whether or not we're able to create benefits from the idea of space innovation or space exploration as a whole, that kind of like the core value of like what that kind of like who kind of like matters in the context of space exploration, or what kind of face represents like the American white American subject and what that mobility offers, isn't something that is offered to the populations that suffer from these impacts that are most vulnerable from these kind of like neutral disasters that the affirmative is invoking. And I feel like whatever critique that you're able to kind of like put in beneath that is also a critique of the idea of just vitality and doing whatever is necessary in order to expand human survival is something that I feel like is really important for this resolution as a whole, and it thus needs to be expanded into like the other critiques that you'll make about like their international modeling systems and the way in which they attempt to like kind of create an international modeling system where the US is able to benefit most from public space exploration while continuing to disenfranchise other countries from being able to access the same resources, which is another paradigm that I think think will show up when people kind of like start to unearth like what this kind of does at an IR level. I think that then when you're kind of thinking about like what you should be considering at a permutation level, a lot of the arguments that I feel like you need to make are about like why we should kind of be like thinking about what development looks like outside the context of space and refusing space's inevitability. I feel like making arguments about like how we should see like space not as something that is an inevitable part of like human expansion, but rather something that is a question of whether or not we repeat the same values that we take from the earth, and it then becomes a question of whether or not we're able to like tend to the ways in which violence is produced on the earth in the first place, is a really good sequencing argument for how you want the alternative to look, and allows you to make a lot of arguments about like why there's kind of mutual exclusivity to the starting point of the affirmative and where the alternative is starting from, which kind of like starts a lot of the offense that you have against the permutation. But I also feel like a lot of the arguments that you need to make is that there is no way in which like black folk as a community can be represented in space under the paradigm of like what nation states are be able to represent in, that the idea of public only represents those that are able to make a nationalistic claim to like an identity that is like created by their country of origin, and making arguments about like how that kind of like thing doesn't exist for black folk, for native people, etc., because of the way in which the U.S. is entrenched in various forms of history that kind of like erase that difference under the modicum of like American whiteness, is a really important way for you to make arguments about why the permutation can't really access any of like the internal net benefits, like what the alternative can produce, and why it doesn't allow for that type of like organizing strategy that will allow black folk, indigenous folk, and other folk that are kind of like ghettoized from the idea of like space exploration to be able to access like things like space and being able to access technology of their own. I then think that when you're getting to a level of impact comparison, this is where that critique of vitality that we've been talking about so much like throughout the rest of these types of argumentation becomes extremely important, because I feel like a lot of the arguments that people read on space are the ways in which they can talk about things like space debris, asteroid collisions, things like that. And so making arguments about why these kind of neutral disasters are not neutral but human produced, and also are ones that kind of like force us to invest in these 1% scenarios in order to protect ourselves at all costs, that's like producing the sacrificial logic of people on the ground that are existing in like already kind of like conditions that are like death or worse than death, are really important in terms of you being are really important in terms of you being able to reconsider the ways in which like policy kind of serves as an arena to kind of like produce those forms of financialization under like the kind of like veil of utilitarian calculus, and why those forms of calculus kind of like fail in terms of thinking about what a kind of like critique of the notion of like capital investment into like what human life value is really starts at, and why that's kind of export into the rest of our politic in relationship to space. And so your impact comparison stuff operates as another place for you to generate more offense and link arguments that can be useful, helpful on. And so hopefully this kind of allows you to think of like the negative bases that you would want to use versus a lot of policy affirmatives, and hopefully 10 more videos I'll be doing talk about racial capitalism and space privatization. Thank you.